So before I'd like to begin, I'd like to acknowledge and pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land of which we meet today virtually from all of the nations which we gather. And I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present, future and emerging. So as I said, with us this evening is our esteemed guest, Didi. Didi is an alumni with a very extensive background in AIESEC, having travelled and worked throughout the world in many locations. And the interesting fact I found was that Didi was one of the founding directors of AIESEC International back in the 80s, which I didn't know that fact until I started to talk to Didi in preparation for this. Didi has a very extensive background in the consulting world, but also being on advisory boards and also having formed multiple companies. And when I went to ask Didi to present to AIESEC Alumni Australia with a topic that is related to COVID and post-COVID for us moving into the emerging opportunities come next year, Didi mentioned to me that he's working on a piece of work on organizational plasticity, which is in the context of change in my practice and my space. So I thought we'll get Didi to share his practice on organizational plasticity, how it can be adapted and utilized by us as individuals, but also into our group, our networks and our organizations and practices. So without further ado, I will hand over to Didi.
Thank you. And I can see that my friends are there. Thierry, bonjour, from the US, Justine, g'day, and Dirk. Okay, let's just run this through so that we can put this on the website. First of all, welcome to all the alumni that will hear to it today or future. Organizational plasticity, let's talk about that, because a lot of people know the concept of neuroplasticity, but today we're going to develop that a little bit further. So today we're going to talk about a little bit about neuroplasticity, and I have a friend of mine that will talk about that on a video. Then we're going to talk about organizational plasticity, and then we're going to talk about a concept called the Organizational Plasticity Index. So let's first go to neuroplasticity. You've all heard about that. So we work together with a lady called Dr. Tara Swart. She is a neuroscientist and is globally the only one that is a coach to senior executives, a neuroscientist, and also actually a doctor. So she has a lot of capabilities, and she has been interviewed on a number of occasions. And the one that I've highlighted, and I've shortened this video a bit to a 7-8 minute video, is where she explains about what neuroplasticity is and how we can increase our own neuroplasticity. It's of course the ability to increase your life by modifying the connections in your brain and what you need to do. So she'll talk about that a little bit, and then in 5 minutes, I'll explain how we do that for an organization. Here we are, Tara.
And then during the teenage years, there's a huge amount of neural pruning. So the brain has grown massively, until about the age of 13. And then it's about making it more sophisticated. So it's not just about bigger is better. It's about, focusing on the pathways that are going to make successful adults out of these teenagers. And so, for example, if you haven't learned 5 languages by the time you're 13, then you don't need some pathways that were wired into your brain, so they just get pruned away. And actually, that active process of the brain being shaped and molded by everything that it experiences, formal learning, every person you meet, every emotion you experience, every memory you recall, that goes on really actively till the age of 25. We used to think that your personality was pretty much formed by the time you were 18. And then from 25 to 65, and this is the area that I find the most exciting, there's so much that you can do to keep your brain really flexible and, keep it learning, keep it growing and changing. If you, learn a new language, if you meet new people, if you travel, of course, you're doing like really good things to your brain, but neuroplasticity works for good or bad. So if you are indulging in bad habits, addictions, going over negative memories, hanging around with people who damage your self-esteem or your confidence, you're also letting neuroplasticity happen to your brain. So it needs to be thought of in that holistic way. And like I mentioned earlier, there does seem to be a window, late 30s, early 40s, where if you have really got on top of your sleep cycle, your diet, your hydration, your oxygenation of your brain, and really positive, meaningful social interactions, you're setting yourself up to age much better than if you don't do those things.
And, you know, the story of neuroplasticity is an interesting one. We obviously used to think it's, you know, you're born with a certain brain and stuck with it, right? And that story has changed enormously over the years. So do you want to take us through a little bit of the knowledge of the story behind neuroplasticity and its discoveries?
Yeah, so the whole, you know, the pendulum swing between, you know, nature and nurture, basically. For a long time, it swung very much in favor of DNA is everything. Now we have this amazing sort of quite emerging field called epigenetics, which is the effect of the environment on your gene expression. So yes, we have certain genes that we inherit from our parents, but we have the ability to switch on or off the expression of some of those through our lifestyle behaviors. If you think of a shoelace, if there's little plastic bits at the end, that's how I describe a telomere, which is at the end of a you know, DNA sequence, is that if you indulge in good lifestyle habits along the lines of what we've discussed already, you keep those neatly closed up. If you indulge in negative lifestyle habits, then they start to fray, and then you start, you know, to get damage and degradation of your DNA. So also that you don't inherit the genes that your parents were born with, you inherit the genes that, you know, what they've done with their lifestyle factors by the time they've conceived you. And we now know a lot of interesting stuff about transgenerational inheritance. So we know that people who were in the Holocaust or in the Dutch famine, who experienced severe stress at a certain fertile time of their life, passed on differently regulated stress responses, not just to their children, but also to their grandchildren. So it's very, very complex, but it's very exciting. So I think the first like really famous story of neuroplasticity was this guy, Phineas Gage, who was a railway worker who got a tamping rod through his brain, and then his personality totally changed. But like I said, for a long time, we only knew about stuff about the brain because of things that went wrong. What we've been able to do now, for example, you know, we're both Londoners, so the London cabbies that do the knowledge. Like when I was doing my PhD, or even for some time after that, we didn't really know if these taxi drivers had a propensity to be able to form knowledge in the part of the hippocampus where memory and navigation are connected, or if the learning actually grew and changed that part of their brain. But since we got the sophisticated scanning technologies, we definitely see that the difference between starting and completing the knowledge has physically changed the part of the brain where memory and navigation are connected. Other sort of, you know, lovely examples of that, and, you know, this is why I say I don't accept hard wiring as an excuse for bad behavior kind of thing, is that, you know, we're so much more malleable than that. So for millennia in our evolution, we lived in caves, alpha males impregnated lots of women and then went off in a nomadic way and maybe came back later, maybe never came back to that cave. So in the history of humanity, for a relatively short period of time, most cultures around the world have asked people to live in unit families. Now, we've known for a long time that when a woman is, you know, has the pregnancy hormones, has the oxytocin during childbirth and breastfeeding, that this is the hormone of bonding that underlies that amazing bond between a new mum and her baby. And we didn't think that oxytocin had an effect on fathers' brains. And as far as we know, we've only known for about 9 years now that new dads' brains, the limbic system where the emotions come from, are altered by oxytocin when they first become a dad. So the oxytocin levels go up, and that's all about feeling warm and cuddly and, you know, wanting to protect, the hug hormone, wanting to protect your baby, rather than testosterone, which would make you want to compete. So we also know that so when you become a new dad, your testosterone levels go down a bit. If the baby sleeps in the same room as both parents, the dad's testosterone levels go down even more. So that's neuroplasticity in action. It's amazing. So for example, we know that if you grew up speaking English, Spanish, and Portuguese, and then you moved from Brazil to England and you still spoke Portuguese at home, but you didn't really speak Spanish anymore, and you speak English a lot more. Again, there's a dynamic map where the more that part of the brain is used, the larger that part grows, and then it overwrites the parts that wither from disuse. So So there was this experiment done on people in their 80s. It was originally done and then remade by the BBC in a film called The Young Ones, but the original research is known as counterclockwise research. There were 3 groups of people in their 80s. One group just were the control group, so they lived like normal for a week. One group were asked to reminisce about being in their 60s for a week. And one group were actually taken to homes that were retrofitted to look like their homes did 20 years ago. If they didn't have the same glasses or walking frames 20 years ago, they were taken away for a week. And they had photos of their younger selves in these homes. And at the end of 1 week, the group that lived in the retrofitted homes, who'd been dropped off outside this place, and these little old ladies in their 80s were told, you've got to take your suitcase up to the bedroom. And they were literally saying, I can't carry a suitcase, I can barely get upstairs. But they were left to sort themselves out, which they of course did. At the end of 1 week, they had increased visual acuity and increased musculoskeletal coordination. The reminiscing group actually had some improvements too, but no way as much as the group that lived like that for a week. So, you know, I always say spend time with younger people, spend time with older people too, because they're so wise. This gives us a whole new angle on mind over matter. So we do know that your intelligence level, and I'm not a big fan of IQ, but, you know, however you rate your intelligence, and that can be just being savvy, it can be being flexible, and your educational level, your formal educational level, does push back the threshold for showing up dementia symptoms by up to 5 years. So we do know that learning has a very, very significant impact on brain health and mental fitness, as you put it. Other forms of learning throughout life, they have to be attention intense enough to create this similar effect. So unfortunately, crosswords and Sudoku, they're not attention intense enough, unless you're like really not a numbers person and you start up Sudoku. But learning a new language or learning a musical instrument are the classic examples of things that are attention intense enough to physically change your brain. You know, for some people, it might be cooking, it might be coding. It's just pushing yourself out of your comfort zone and having to make such an effort that it actually builds up new neural pathways in your brain.
So, in fact, you know, what are the 3 tips that you have for us to take away?
Okay, so just as a general overview, I'd like to say, you know, be amazed by how much potential your brain has. It's way more than we ever thought. Be prepared to do the hard work, but understand that the benefit that you will get is greater than just the thing that you choose to learn, for example. But the 3 sort of mechanisms for inducing neuroplasticity are aerobic exercise. And I know you put up one of my favorite quotes on Instagram the other day, which is, if you regularly do aerobic exercise, you've got a 12 to 13% turnover rate of, you know, neurogenesis, which is new cells turning into neurons, embryonic cells turning into neurons. If you've been a couch potato and then you start exercising, that goes up to 30%. So that's definitely my excuse for that with my on-off exercise schedule. Novelty is another thing that induces neuroplasticity. So exposing yourself to new things. You know, in a very primitive way, this can feel threatening for the brain, but actually it's a way to, like, you know, get that intensity that you require. And then emotional intensity also has a very big effect on the brain. So there I'd probably give a word of warning, which is that if you experience, you know, a lot of stress or you have a negative interaction, that, you know, that can become like a loop in your brain. So it's either about protecting yourself from that or like inducing really positive emotions to help you on your learning journey.
Okay, so that was Tara Swart. Now with Tara Swart, what we've done, so she's our in-house neuroscientist. So she works with us on concepts of neuroscience and she helps us. I'm having my call with her at 9 o'clock tonight. And so we developed a concept called organizational plasticity. So that is the concept of a bit of background. She started in July 13, 2018. That's when the term came first sort of thrown into the world. And it is a metaphor for how a company works alongside how a brain works, not just on the neocortex, but all across. And so this is what Dr. Swart is now teaching at MIT. She's doing her first program of this nature in February, and she's using an application that we've developed with her to make that neuroscience for business happen. So that's what Tara Swart is doing. So we have developed these 4 dimensions, and she's mentioned them before. Just get ready to hear these words a few times. One is called epigenetics, one is called myelination, one is called synaptic connections, and the other one is called neurogenesis. Yes, so epigenetics has to do with the gene propagation. Myelination has to do with the way we make decisions and the speed thereof. Synaptic connections has to do with how we relate, how the synapses relate to each other. And then neurogenesis has everything to do with innovation and how things get reborn. Yeah, how neurons get reborn. So first of all, let's talk a little bit about epigenetics. First of all, in the brain, how does it work? So in the brain, it is the influence of the environment on the expression of your DNA. That means, to what extent does the environment that we live in affect our DNA? And that's why genes are not just the same as mom and dad added together, and grandmother and granddads. It is actually a very large part, an influence of how fathers and mothers, and especially fathers, have lived and interacted with their environment, and they give that through to the children. And this impacts a range of behaviors and measures of mental and physical well-being. What we're going to focus on is the influence of the environment on the expression of your DNA. So we're going to say, what does epigenetic means in an organizational context? So organizational epigenetics, we say, is the impact of the organizational DNA, which is the culture of the organization, what the organization does and how they do it and how they progress from one sort of year to another on the future being of a business, whether that be positive or negative, in its chosen environment. So we measure that organizational epigenetics. And then what I'm going to do as an exercise, not with you guys, but a bit later, is to define what are some additional processes that people have that can positively impact on the epigenetics of an organization. So what are some processes that affect the epigenetics? What affects the culture? Yeah, the way we talk, the way we interact, the way we promote people, the way we induct people, the way we treat people, the way we choose to live in an environment of pure profit or an environment that is conducive to the growth of the planet. What are all these conditions that we live in? And all these processes determine who we are and how epigenetically viable we are for the organization. So that's the first one, epigenetics, yeah, to do with the gene, the culture of the organization. The second one is myelination, big word, but what that really is, and you can see that there on the chart, these little sort of square or rectangular overlays of a neuron. It's a fatty coating that insulates the axons of a neuron. And axons are the wires, yeah, that connect the neurons to other neurons. The actual myelination process is one where the speed and the decision-making of these neural pathways gets affected. So we're talking here about the quality and the speed of decision-making. That's what it does in the brain. Now, if you translate that to the organization in a business, decision-making is all about, and the speed thereof is all about the clarity of the goals, the vision, the mission, and the purpose. They all act as what we call myelinating factors. Yeah, and so we rely on the efficient communication running through the business to help keep organizations' decisions on track. So to what extent is your company, your organization structured in such a way that the decisions it makes are in line with what it needs to be? And remember, if you connect myelination with epigenetics, we're talking about what decisions do you make in your company to help it survive as a structure, as an organism in today's society. And as we know, a lot of companies have made a whole set of wrong decisions, going for extraction of oil too much, or a set of decisions that goes too much focusing on money. And that is not what we believe the positive myelination effect. Yeah? So what we want to do is create a positive myelination effect. And then again, what are some of the business decisions or processes that positively impact on the myelination? How can we make decisions that make us operate in the right environment? We at Arowana, we are I work for a company called Arowana, and they have a B Corp status. And the B Corp status helps you a lot with that decision making. What are the right decisions that you need to make in order to live and make the right decisions in the right environment? So that's number 2. 1, epigenetics. 2, myelination. Number 3 is what we call the synaptic connections. So synaptic connections are in the brain, the connections, the strength thereof between existing neurons, and that can be affected by two things, either the depth of the experience or the repetition of the behavior or the experience. So if something happens to you often, like me speaking English or me speaking Dutch, that neural pathway gets developed quite strongly. Or if something very deep happens to me, like a friend of mine, I was talking to him today, and his younger brother died two hours before I spoke to him. And he was quite affected by it. So that was for him a very deep emotional experience that affected a lot of his thinking on the finality of his life. And we had a deep conversation about that. But you can see that certain behaviors and pathways and experiences are very strong and they only happen once or twice, or some of them are very repetitive. And again, we're focusing on the depth and the repetition of these. And if we translate synaptic connections, these connections to an organization, we can see that what we mean with that is the quality of the communication and the quality of the relationship that you have with all your stakeholders, both internally and externally. So how well do you connect and how well do you communicate between them? And how do you make the environment such that what we call the oxytocin factor, the happy hormone, actually exists in your organization, so that there is a positive ongoing relationship. And increasingly, the stakeholders are not just your shareholders. Increasingly, the stakeholders are Greta Thunberg, the United Nations, people that have to live with the waste that you leave behind. Increasingly, we look at that as stakeholders and not just the narrow concept of let's find some board members, some stakeholders, and some customers. It is much broader. And the more broad you do, the more expansionist you think. So that's around synaptic connections. And again, we're looking at examples of where business processes can positively impact on these synaptic connections. So we've done epigenetics, basically the culture. We've done myelination, basically the decision-making and leadership in that. We've done the synaptic connections, which is relationships and the connections you have with your shareholders, with your stakeholders. And then the last one is what Dr. Tara Swart also spoke about, which is called neurogenesis. And in the brain, neurogenesis is the growth of new neurons that connect with existing neurons. So this is something that's quite new in the research. People did not think that neurogenesis was happening past the age of 25, as Tara said. Now we know that neurogenesis, although not as easily, but can happen all the way through life. And that's one of the fundamentals of neuroplasticity for individuals. And if you want, just type a TED talk on neurogenesis. There's a French lady that absolutely explains it also in a brilliant way. And what we focus on is the strengthening of existing and the building of new pathways. So where I said that epigenetics is culture, myelination is decision-making, synaptic connections is relationships. Number 4, neurogenesis has everything to do with innovation. In an organizational context, organizational neurogenesis deals with everything that has to do with innovation, be it a new process, a new way of working, a new person joining your company. All that is part of the innovation process that we call organizational neurogenesis. So with that, we have a number of processes that are associated. I've mentioned some of them. And so that finalizes the discussion on organizational plasticity. And now we're going to go to the organizational plasticity index. So what we've done at Arowana is we've created an index that measures companies' ability to be organically and organizationally plastic. We call that the OPI, Organizational Plasticity Index. And what we mean with that is the concept of organizational plasticity index is based on the fact that an organization is a function of a collective brain power of all the people involved in it. And so what we say is it is determined by a set of algorithms, and we've developed a set of algorithms that take into account the organization. You can see that at the bottom, the team and the individual. So we have a set of algorithms that manage that. It gets a little bit technical, and I don't want to go too much into detail, but for each one of these 3, organizational, team, and individual, we have a number of scores. So of course, organizational, I just explained there's 4 dimensions that determine organizational plasticity. And for each one of those, we get a score. The impact score for each one of those is basically a relative positioning in your industry. So for some industries, innovation is very important. For other industries, quick decision-making is very important. So that's why we put that impact score there. But you can see the OPI is a combination of these 4 scores, plus a team plasticity index, which is basically all the teams get measured, and we put a number around that, and then they get your KPI, which is a weighted average. And of course, leadership's KPIs are much more important than people that sort of work on the side and do a small project on the side. So it depends on where you are placed in the organization, what the relative impact is of your team plasticity. Individual plasticity is everybody individually gets added up and gets put into the matrix. They do a test called the Neurozone score. If you want to write that down, the Neurozone score, you can all do that. You get one time for free. You can go there to that website and see what your personal Neurozone score is, around 10 dimensions. And then you can see how good your individual plasticity is and where it is important. My biggest improvement needs to happen in sleep. I tend to not sleep, and sleep. So she said, Dr. Tara said that sleep, oxygenation, which happens through exercise, and then nutrition are the 3 most important things that you can do for personal plasticity and individual plasticity improvement. So please follow that for you as an individual. Let's go back to the organization. We said that that is the concept of bringing together all these aspects in an organization, and then you get a number. And this is an example of the app that we've developed, which gives you a number. We can't use the real faces of people because privacy. But so what we do is we have a number of respondents and we can calculate the OPI. You can see the OPI of this company is 7.4 out of 10. And then the biggest improvement needs to happen in myelination, which to me tells me that the leadership has to improve a fair bit. Surprisingly, epigenetics is higher than what I thought it was for this company. And you can there see, you can drill deeper into what it is that each of these people said. We use a video interviewing, so people interview themselves using their phone, and we do an AI based on IBM, Microsoft, Amazon, and Google facial recognition to see to what extent their answers are congruent with their moods, and from that we get a number of sentiment analysis. So that's the algorithms that we use to make that app work. And so that's the organizational plasticity index. But now we're going to sort of summarize. We're nearly at the end. So we've talked about neuroplasticity, we've talked about organizational plasticity, and we talked about an organizational plasticity index. How are you going to measure for your company what your plasticity is? And the question is, so what? You know, how can I apply this in my organization, or can I become a certified consultant? So these are some suggestions that I have. Give me a shout, and that's more for the people that will look at this video later. Give me a shout on LinkedIn. And if you want to be part of a research project, we want to make this a research project so that we have more and more data to verify our findings. And what we do with companies, if they say, hey, can I improve my OPI score? How can I become better as a company living in today's society? How can I improve the score of my individuals, of my teams, of my company? And we say, let's go through what we call organizational plasticity methodology, which interestingly enough has the acronym of PLAST, and you will see plasticity. So it's got 10 steps in it. First we prepare. I'm not going to give them all away, but we have a number of tools and a number of activities that we do in each of these dimensions. So you prepare, you learn, you analyze, you synthesize, you transition. It means you find transition what you've learned in the synthesis phase. And then after that, you improve, you cascade, you integrate, you transform, and you yield. There you've got plasticity, all worked out as a problem-solving methodology. I use this from Six Sigma, where I used the MAIC, and I find this one more useful. Right? So this is what we do in terms of helping companies to increase their organizational plasticity. So this is what we've done. We discussed these 3 concepts. If there's any questions, please ask. And instead of calling it the end, I tend to call it the beginning. Yeah. So I have like 5 minutes if there's questions or thoughts.
So did I understand it correctly in Dr. Swart's talk?
Yeah.
That the genes actually change over time?
Yes. Yes.
Really?
So, well, first of all, I must tell you, all people listening, I am not a neuroscientist. So I am not qualified to answer in a scientific way all the questions. But what Dr. Tara said is that it is not necessarily so much the genes that change in a lifetime. It's more the activation of what we call the RNA. You have DNA and RNA, and it's the activation of certain endings of the shoelaces, right? Either you activate them or not. For example, Thierry, you speak 3-4 languages. Your linguistic capabilities are very well in tuned. But for me, for example, I have not run 300 meters since I've been at university. So for me, the physical behaviors associated with, and also the neuro behaviors associated with physical activity, for me, they have unraveled. So what happens with, and this is the male thing, if a male goes to, gives the sperm to the offspring, whatever has happened in his life up to the moment of him donating the sperm to the next generation, these changes will be given through into the DNA of the next generation. That's how little by little, and that's how you can explain evolution over a long period of time, how things modify and change. Very complex, but again, I recommend if you Google epigenetics, it's a whole new branch of science that's developing very strongly alongside the genetics engineering. So if you want, I've got one more little giveaway, but wait, there's more. So what we're now thinking about, I don't know if in talking, Thierry, about the gene. So in the book, The Gene, the writer, Siddhartha Mukherjee, highlights 3 concepts that have defined the 20th century. So the 3 scientific concepts. One is the atom, which is the code of quantum physics, the byte, which is the code of computing and artificial intelligence, and then the gene, which is the code of life. And we spoke about that just now in evolution. So what we're proposing is a fourth sort of concept that can help us in the 21st century. And this one, we call that societal plasticity. So you got individual plasticity, organizational plasticity, and then I'm going for societal plasticity. This is a project that I have on the site. And there, the word that I want to introduce is called the HOSA, which is derived from Homo sapiens, right? Homo sapiens, HOSA. And that would underpin all social interaction. So it has an impact on everything from the formation of organizations to the unity of nations. And the building blocks, you know that the building blocks of DNA have these 4 letters. I sort of replicated that and said, no matter which culture or which part of history people have lived in, everything they've done has been a result of thoughts, words, decisions, and actions that they've taken. And so with that, we build structures such as relating, spiritual beliefs, loving, fighting. And although the outcome, as it is for everybody, is survival, we propose that for human structures, it's the same for society. So we are talking about the HOSA being the cultural DNA. That's just something that's probably a book that I'll write when I'm 80 to keep my brain active, but that's building on all the other concepts. But first, we want to go with this one, which is the Organizational Plasticity Index. So that was my little summary. It's a lot, but it's all there. So Andrew?
I wanted to really thank you on sharing that, David. I can relate to it from my practice in change management and innovation in the corporate space, but having you be able to share that frame from a biological perspective where in organizations and societies, by default, they're highly complex, highly interconnected and network and dynamic and changing, both from the values of the organization, but the interaction of humans, and be able to look into neuroscience and see what can we draw from that. So this is fantastic in my practice. I'm excited to know more about it. So we'll definitely be talking. And then elevating it to the societal level too. Having that feedback loop so that it's people, teams, individuals, leaders, organization, entities,
And then society.
and then society. So it's full circle and full encompassing. Yeah, thank you very much for sharing it.
That's okay. And for the people that are listening, the reason why Andrew called me David is because I'm very closely linked to David Saxon Gross, who's the three of us. I know the three of us live together. So, work together quite closely. So we have interchangeable names. Okay. Again, thank you all, and especially the people that will listen in later on. If you want, connect to me by LinkedIn, and then we'll see where this journey goes to. And as I said, it's just the beginning. I think there's a lot more to come. As you can see in a lot of articles, society is shifting, and it has to shift for the better. Why? Because people like you guys and girls are actually working on making it happen. So that's why it will shift for the better. I have a strong belief in that.
Yep.
Right?
Okay. Thank you, Dirk.
Thank you, Dirk.
Thank you, Dirk. Everyone, for joining wherever you are. And this would be made available through a YouTube channel, which would be released soon. And we'll share the details through to you. And we do have AIESECs every single month as well. So we're in the process of planning the speakers for next year. So stay tuned. We do also have the AIESEC Alumni Australia Facebook and LinkedIn page and groups. And then the AIESEC series is also at the APAC level as well. So it's one of many speakers and sessions that the AIESEC Alumni Network is putting together. Yeah.
There you go. I'll stop sharing.